New numbers from Statistics Canada show Canadians continue to shun travel to the United States.
Because U.S. President Donald Trump launched a trade war, has also been referring to Canada as the 51st state, which has really left a bad taste in people's mouths.
Canadian travelers have cost the American economy $4.5 billion and show no inclination of returning in 2026.
$4.5 billion. That's the price the United States has paid, so far, for a year-long Canadian tourism boycott. No spin, no diplomatic sugarcoating, no political excuse changes this simple fact. Canadians stopped traveling south, and America bled billions. And this wasn't a government directive or some coordinated retaliation from Ottawa. It was a quiet, decisive response from ordinary Canadians who chose to shut their wallets on the world's largest economy. After 12 straight months of decline, the message is unmistakable. Push Canada too far, and Canadians will simply walk away. But here's the twist Washington didn't see coming. This isn't just a Canada versus US story anymore. What began as a Canadian backlash is now evolving into something far broader, a global pullback from the United States itself.
The numbers paint a picture of a steady, deliberate retreat. Road trips into the U.S., historically the most common way Canadians traveled south, collapsed by 27% this January compared to a year earlier. Air travel, usually immune to political fluctuations, fell by 18%. That drop wasn't an isolated blip. For 12 straight months, Canadian travel into the U.S. has posted double-digit declines. Over the full year, 4 million Canadians simply chose not to go. Their absence, repeated millions of times, erased billions in revenue for American hotels, restaurants, malls, casinos, ski resorts, and airports. And because Canadians represent roughly 1/4 of all international visitors to the U.S., the impact cuts straight into the core of America's tourism-driven states. Behind this retreat lies a familiar political climate. Trump's renewed tariffs on Canadian goods, his threats to treat Canada as a subordinate 51st state, and his push for new import penalties after courts struck down earlier measures all helped poison public sentiment north of the border. Even Congress tried to intervene, blocking some of Trump's tariff actions after lawmakers from tourism-dependent districts raised the alarm. But by the time Washington woke up, the Canadian consumer had already walked away.
The most striking part of this story is that Prime Minister Mark Carney never called for retaliation. Canadians coordinated nothing. They simply looked at the political climate in Washington and concluded they didn't want to spend their money there. A skipped family vacation to Florida or a canceled shopping run to Buffalo might feel small on its own, but each decision carries a clear message. If the United States treats Canada like an adversary, Canadian households will treat America like an expendable destination. This is not symbolic diplomacy. This is an economic reaction delivered through everyday choices, and the combined effect is more potent than any formal sanction. For years, Washington acted as though Canada needed the American tourism market far more than the reverse. The past 12 months have shattered that assumption. In the U.S., tourism supports millions of jobs and pours tax revenue into border states that rely heavily on cross-border weekend traffic. When Canadian SUVs stop appearing at outlet malls, when cross-border flights run half-empty, when northern hotels lose winter bookings, the shockwaves spread quickly. Several U.S. counties along the border have already reported revenue drops approaching double digits. Airlines have begun reducing capacity on certain routes. Restaurant and hospitality groups are warning of staffing cuts if the trend continues. The irony is painful. Tariffs that were meant to pressure Canada are now ricocheting back into the American economy. The pain is highly concentrated in specific states. Michigan, where Canadians account for nearly 40% of international visitors, has reported sharp winter declines in hotel occupancy around Detroit and the border towns of Port Huron and Sault Ste. Marie. New York is seeing similar shortfalls in Niagara County, where Canadian spending typically injects hundreds of millions of dollars each year. Local businesses are now reporting double-digit drops in weekend revenue. Even Maine, which relies heavily on cross-border day trips from New Brunswick and Quebec, has flagged a downturn significant enough to threaten seasonal hiring in retail and hospitality. These are not abstract numbers. They are state-level fiscal warning signs triggered directly by Canada's absence.
Canada's strategic strength is often discussed in terms of resources: oil, electricity, nickel, graphite, and the minerals that increasingly anchor North American supply chains. But this moment reveals an entirely different type of leverage. Tourism, normally seen as a cultural exchange or a lifestyle choice, has become a tool of soft power that carries measurable financial weight. With no central coordination, Canadians have demonstrated an economic influence Washington cannot counter with tariffs or legal threats. In a year defined by strained diplomacy, this quiet collective action has become one of Canada's most effective responses. What began as a uniquely Canadian reaction is now starting to echo internationally. Early travel data from Europe and Asia suggests a shift in global sentiment. Long-haul visitors are now favoring destinations perceived as stable, predictable, and politically calm. Many point to U.S. border practices, fluctuating immigration rules, steep travel costs, and the general unpredictability of the Trump administration as reasons for choosing alternatives. For major American cities that depend on international tourists, New York, Los Angeles, Miami, Seattle, this trend is alarming. If the United States were to lose even 10% of its global inbound tourism, the economic fallout could surpass $30 to $40 billion and threaten hundreds of thousands of jobs. The growing perception abroad is clear. The U.S. is no longer the effortless, default travel destination it once was.
Meanwhile, Canada is benefiting from the redirection. International visitors are choosing Canadian destinations for their safety, political stability, and predictable governance. This plays directly into Carney's broader strategy of diversifying Canada's economic ties and projecting the country as a reliable partner at a time when America's internal politics appear volatile. As other nations look at their options, Canada presents itself as the North American experience without the American uncertainty. That matters deeply heading into the 2026 USMCA review, where Ottawa will be negotiating from a position of increasing diplomatic credibility and economic resilience.
Canada didn't set out to punish the United States, but its citizens, through millions of individual choices, ended up delivering a message that Washington cannot ignore. When the U.S. escalates hostility, people do not respond with sympathy. They respond by withdrawing. What began as a Canadian boycott is now evolving into a wider reassessment of America's role as a global destination. Other countries are beginning to think the same thought Canadians acted upon. If the United States wants to close itself off, the world will simply spend its money elsewhere. The question now is whether Washington understands the scale of what is happening. Because if this trend continues, the next headline won't be about a $4.5 billion loss. It will be about the moment the United States realized it was no longer the center of global travel, and Canada helped reveal that truth first.
Mr. Speaker, they say their budget is a prop and its contents are imaginary. We're in real trouble.
In Ottawa, the political heat hit full blast this week as Prime Minister Mark Carney and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre clashed over the 2025 federal budget, a showdown that's now dominating Canada's political landscape.
Mr. Speaker, this budget is an investment budget. It's a budget for generational investment. The pace of investment is twice as quick, and this budget is going to stimulate $1 trillion worth of investment by the end of the decade. It's a growth budget for Quebec, for Canada.
Carney called it a generational investment plan designed to shield Canadians from U.S. tariffs and rebuild confidence in a shaken economy. Poilievre called it a fictional accounting and accused Carney of driving up food and housing costs through a hidden industrial carbon tax. Their fiery exchanges in the House of Commons have reignited the country's biggest debate: who really has a plan to make life affordable again?
Carney's $90 billion budget lays out a vision of infrastructure renewal, clean energy tax credits, and a national Buy Canadian procurement rule to counter the fallout from U.S. tariffs. He warned that Trump's tariff blitz is already costing Canada roughly 1.8% of GDP, about $50 billion a year. His message: we can't control what the U.S. does, but this is Canada. We can build the future we want. Highlights include a legislative fast track for the Alto high-speed rail between Toronto and Quebec City, massive clean energy credits worth billions for Quebec and Ontario manufacturers, a housing affordability plan promising 47,000 GST-reduced homes for first-time buyers. But in Parliament, Poilievre hammered Carney with sharp questions. Will the Prime Minister tell Canadians that an industrial carbon tax isn't driving up food and housing prices? Carney shot back that the impact of the industrial carbon levy on food prices is approximately zero. He argued that the budget will stimulate $1 trillion in private sector investment by the end of the decade.
This isn't just a budget fight, it's a clash of economic philosophies. Poilievre frames the carbon tax as the root of every affordability crisis: food, housing, and energy. Carney, a former Bank of England governor, frames it as a non-factor, arguing that the real threat to affordability is the chaos coming from Washington's tariff wall. The timing matters. With President Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos now in effect, Ottawa faces one of its toughest trade climates in decades. Carney's budget reads like an emergency blueprint, a mix of fiscal stimulus and industrial nationalism meant to keep Canada's economy from being collateral damage.
Poilievre has found a potent target: the housing crisis. He accuses Carney of taxing the dream of home ownership by applying industrial carbon costs to construction materials, steel, glass, and cement. Carney counters that his government is cutting GST for home builders and funding co-ops, but the optics are tough. Mortgage rates remain high and housing affordability has become the most emotional issue in the country.
Carney's insistence that tariffs, not taxes, are the real problem resonates with economists. Bloomberg notes that the U.S. tariffs could erase up to $50 billion from Canada's output. His budget's Buy Canadian clause, prioritizing domestic steel, cement, and tech suppliers, mirrors Trump's own playbook, but flips it towards self-reliance. In short, Carney is turning protectionism back on its author.
For Carney, this is the defining test of his young premiership. His technocratic style, data-driven, measured, and internationalist, contrasts sharply with Poilievre's populist fire. But while Carney talks about hope, growth, and investment, many Canadians still feel squeezed. Food bank lineups have doubled since 2019, and inflation, though easing, remains painful. If voters don't feel relief by spring 2026, Poilievre's simple message of axe the tax, build the homes could overshadow Carney's trillion-dollar ambitions.
Carney's $90 billion plan also walks a fine line between stimulus and credibility. Reuters reports that about a third of this new spending will be financed through borrowing, but Carney insists it's investment, not debt. His argument: each federal dollar will attract up to 3 in private capital through green credits and infrastructure partnerships. It's a bold claim, and one that will define his credibility as an economist prime minister. If growth fails to appear by 2026, this could become his political Achilles heel. At the same time, his Buy Canadian rule marks a break from decades of free trade orthodoxy. By tying procurement for major projects like the high-speed rail between Toronto and Quebec City to domestic suppliers, Carney is effectively reshoring Canada's industrial base. It's protectionism with a purpose: to turn Trump's tariffs into a catalyst for homegrown production.
Carney's defense of the industrial carbon levy remains one of the most polarizing moments of this budget debate. Economists at the University of Guelph and RBC Economics agree the tax adds less than 1% to food inflation, yet Poilievre's narrative resonates more powerfully. His axe the tax mantra reduces complex fiscal policy into something emotional and easy to rally around. Carney's calm explanations sound factual, but in a cost of living crisis, emotion often wins over logic. Still, Carney's message that the real danger is U.S. tariff volatility, not Canada's climate policy, is slowly gaining traction among business leaders. Bloomberg described it as Canada's quiet answer to Trump's chaos. That contrast between technocratic steadiness and populist fury may shape the country's political identity heading into 2026.
This parliamentary duel also mirrors the new North American order. In Washington, Trump's tariff revival is reshaping global trade. In Ottawa, Carney is answering with fiscal activism and economic sovereignty. In Beijing and Seoul, Canada is forging new partnerships, from critical minerals to high-speed rail technology, to diversify away from U.S. dependence. In other words, this budget isn't just about dollars and cents, it's about whether Canada can stand on its own in a protectionist world.
Carney's defense of the carbon levy may win economists, but the battle for public sentiment is far from over. As question period closed, Poilievre sneered, "If the tax is imaginary, then so is your budget." Carney didn't flinch. He called it a budget of hope, but hope alone won't pay for groceries or rent. The real question, can Carney's trillion-dollar investment plan deliver results before frustration turns into a political landslide? For Carney, this is more than a fiscal test. It's a referendum on whether Canada can reinvent itself under pressure. His challenge is to prove that investment, not ideology, can restore affordability and confidence. For Poilievre, it's proof that frustration can still beat reason in modern politics. The outcome will define not just the next election, but Canada's path in an age of tariffs and turbulence.